Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my history reaction channel. Well, we're here. We have done 6 days straight of the Great Northern War by kings and generals. We've also done 5 days straight so far of the atomic age and nuclear accident and things themed along that line. I thought we would close off that particular theme with the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism by a channel called The Cold War, which I believe, as this screen shows you, is affiliated with Kings and Generals. So, as always, I will put a link to the original content in the description below. If you like what you see here, consider going over to The Cold War and showing them a little bit of love and support. We want to encourage them to keep making content for the rest of us to enjoy and to learn from. Alright, with that said, let's get into this. I've never seen this video before. I know a decent amount about the McCarthy era and the Second Red Scare, and a fair amount about the First Red Scare as well, although not as much as I do about the second one. So let's get into this, let's talk about this, and see what we can learn.
Shout out to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is a...
Okay, we're going to skip this because this video is old enough. Alright, we're back.
The relationship between the left and the United States has a tumultuous history. The story of organized labor and movements surrounding workers' rights, unions, and the general class struggle in the US is some of the most violent out there.
Yeah.
Many people died for 5-day work weeks, 8-hour workdays, and basic standards in the workplace.
Yeah, but it wasn't all due to violence in labor strikes and that kind of thing. Don't get me wrong, labor unions had a lot to do with this in almost all cases. And there was a lot of violence around this. The classic example would be, for example, the Pullman strike, but there are many other examples as well. But accidents also played a big part in a lot of the changes that take place. Now, a lot of labor unions are behind some of the court cases that push these accidents into the court system and lead to change, but we can't overlook the role of accidents in some of these changes as well. An example would be my brain just fried, Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. In that case, you had a fire in a factory. The emergency exits were locked. The fire equipment that was in the building failed to work properly. Some of it didn't work at all. It was outdated, not well maintained. So a lot of people died. Now this leads to a lot of changes in the laws afterwards because of all these deaths. And that's why to this day, emergency exits can't be locked, they can't be blocked. You have to keep the area around emergency exits clear for a certain distance on all sides. It's why public buildings, and that includes private businesses that are open to the public, have to meet minimal safety standards for fire. You have to have fire extinguishers. You have to have them inspected annually, or not annually, but periodically, to ensure that everything's working correctly. Things of that nature. You also have things like can't remember the name of it. Sorry, I had to stop and look that one up because it was going to drive me crazy otherwise. I was going to say the coal mine disaster back in 1907 was instrumental in formation of the Bureau of Mine and increased mine safety. There were over 300 miners killed in that accident. So these are a couple of examples of where accidents lead to reform. So yes, labor unions are a big part of this. And yes, a lot of people died through crackdowns on labor unions, either directly by the government or by other means. But there was also a lot of accidental deaths that contribute to this. Another example I can think of is the Coconut Grove fire. That one occurred a little later, but it was basically a nightclub. You had a lot of people way over capacity. That's strike number one. The doors opened inward, so it was when people tried to escape, the people in front got pushed up against the doors. They couldn't open them because they had to open them inward. People in the back are pushing, trying to get out, and they're basically trapping themselves as a result, which leads to things like more strict adherence to maximum capacities for public areas and doors being required to open outward, or to be, in the case of sliding doors, they have to have mechanisms that allow them to be pushed outward and broken open that way. That's where we get a lot of these changes throughout the 20th century, especially. The first half of the 20th century, we see a lot of government regulation coming in, culminating in OSHA much later, and I think, 1970? It's when it really finishes off. But before that, yeah, you had labor unions. People were dying just for things like the fighting. A lot of people were fighting, but some people were even dying to get us things like the 5-hour work week, or 5-day work week, or the 40-hour week. Before that, there just wasn't anything.
The labor struggle in the US was so violent, in fact, even a presidential assassination can be linked to it.
Linked, yeah, loosely. I mean, I'm not sure we really know Oswald's motive specifically for shooting Kennedy. Not like he left a manifesto or anything like that. But he very definitely had communist sympathies. He had defected to the Soviet Union famously. He married a Soviet wife, Marina. He was, at the time of the assassination of Kennedy, he was heavily involved in the Cuban movement, the Free Cuban movement. So yeah, you could argue that he had definitely had communist sympathies. If you want to use that as a link to this, you can. But since we really don't know his specific motivation for killing Kennedy, that's a tenuous link at best. All you can say is that he had communist leanings.
Now, socialist movements and the activism of the left in general comes from these labor movements. So, given the history, socialism has never really been embraced in the American political system in the annals of power. I mean, even today, the country lacks a socialist party or a labor party.
I'll take some issue with that. If we're talking in terms of a viable socialist or labor party, then absolutely he's right. But we don't really have a viable third party right now at all, of any kind. Some are better than others in terms of having influence. And certainly on the lower levels, on the lowest levels, like local governments, cities, counties, that kind of thing, then we do have some Socialist Party members who are in positions of power. Or I think we have 1 or 2 Labor Party people in power. That one's actually much less impactful. But we do have a current Socialist Party. We've had one for the last 130 years at least. But if we're talking anybody that's going to knock the top 2 out of the game, no. We do have members of the Democratic Party, specifically, I should say, Bernie Sanders, who is a self-described Democratic Socialist. But as far as the Socialist Party, we do have them. We have one at least that does occasionally show up in elections, again, especially on the local level where they do okay. When you get to the state level, not so much. On the federal level, in modern history, they've not really made a mark at all. Now, if you go back to the 1910s, a little different story. So when he said we've never had it, that's where I really want to quibble. In the 1910s, we had a Socialist Party of America, I think is what it was called. And it was not a major contender, but still a significant one, especially in the election, I want to say, was it 1912, when you had Wilson and Taft and Theodore Roosevelt, in a 3-way race, because at that point Theodore had broken off from the Republicans, founded his own independent progressive or bull moose party. And in that year, you also had the Socialist Party of America under Eugene Debs. And Debs finished, I think, with 6% of the popular vote, which may not seem like a lot, but when you've got a 3-way election dividing the votes 3 ways, that 6% becomes kind of significant. And that is the best percentage-wise that any socialist group, a party, has ever done in this country in a federal election, or presidential election, I should say. Now, Debs did run again in, I want to say it was 1920. I could be a little off on these years. The exact dates have never been a strong point of mine. Before I was a historian, I was a historical geologist. And we deal a lot more with relative time there than absolute time. In other words, what comes before what rather than the exact dates. And my mindset was formed by that, and I still tend to, when I'm looking at history, think in terms of what's happening in relation to other things more than I do specific dates. That's a failing of mine, I admit it. So if I'm off on the dates, I'm sorry. I'm within a year or two anyway. I'm in the right decade, let's put it that way. But yeah, I think it was the 1920 election. Debs got the most votes in a presidential election any socialist party has ever gotten, just shy of 1 million. And that was while he was in prison. So that's kind of actually impressive. But that particular vote, he got a much smaller margin of the popular vote by percent. So he really had no impact there.
Certain countries. Okay, so with that being established, we then get to 1917 and the founding of the Soviet Union. The First World War created an upsurge in patriotism in many countries involved, including the United States. Many socialist and anarchist currents were opposed to the war, and this led to a strong antagonism towards them. Many prominent figures of the progressive era in the United States found themselves brought low for taking stands against the war. And then the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia. This created a massive backlash against these leftist movements. It combined with strong anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic sentiments at the time, which saw these movements as foreign intervention by immigrants, but especially Jews. A moral panic led to the years of 1917 to 1920, experiencing harsh crackdowns on socialist and anarchist movements. This even included a wartime sedition act to prevent criticizing the war.
Yeah, that happened under Wilson, and it's one of the worst laws we've ever had. This and Adams' version, the Aliens and Sedition Acts, are two of the worst laws we've ever passed, in my opinion, because they make it a crime to criticize the president, to criticize the war in this case. That's why Debs was in prison and running for president in the 1920s. He was in prison for criticizing the war, for wanting to stay out of it. So these are very, I don't even know how to say it, detrimental to our society, these acts. They make it, the bedrock of one of the bedrocks of our country is freedom of speech. The ability to criticize our president if we don't agree with him, to criticize policies if we don't agree with them. This is a government of the people, for the people, by the people. If we can't express our viewpoints, then how can it be a government of the people, for the people, by the people? And when you have laws like the sedition laws, you have laws that prevent you from criticizing the government or criticizing what they're doing, you're basically hamstringing our involvement in the government that's supposed to be representing us. So it's very problematical on so many levels.
Xenophobia led to the Palmer raids, which deported many of the left-wing immigrants, including influential labor leaders like Emma Goldman. Anti-syndicalism laws gave the police powers to hunt down and jail anyone suspected of being a communist, socialist, social democrat, or anarchist, and if they were immigrants, deporting them.
Yeah, so this is what we're literally talking about here. It's if you're suspected, that's the key word there, suspected, you could be arrested, you could be deported. This is a crackdown on free speech. This is a crackdown on the right to peaceably assemble, crackdown on so many of our basic rights, our right to a fair trial. Because, again, this is just based on suspicion. They don't have to have evidence, they just have to have suspicion. Now, I'm not sure in the first Red Square how far that went in terms of after you're arrested, whether you get due process or not. That I'm not as familiar with the first Red Square as I am with the second one, Red Scare, as I am with the second one. But it was still terrifying if you were somebody who might be accused. And you could be accused by people who just had a grudge against you. And that's the issue. That's the real problem here, and it's going to be a much bigger problem in the second Red Scare.
So that was the first Red Scare and established the challenging environment many left-wing people in America had to endure. Now, let's fast forward a couple of decades. In the wake of the Second World War, President Truman feared communist influence from the USSR, as well as criticism from the right wing of the Republican Party that he was soft on communism. In response, Truman signed Executive
Project
Order
Loyalty.
9835,
Yeah.
which goes by the other name of
Loyalty.
the Loyalty Order.
Right.
It gave the FBI orders to hunt down secret communists in the public service. It resulted in about 3 million investigations, 300 firings, and an infamous list created by the Attorney General of subversive organizations.
I see they've got a sign, Dalton Trumbo is going to jail, free the Hollywood 10. Dalton Trumbo grew up here where I live. There's actually a statue to him in our downtown Main Street area. He was a famous screenwriter. In this period, he was part of the Hollywood 10. He was blacklisted. But yeah, we've got a statue of him in his bathtub, of all things, down on our Main Street. If you don't understand that reference, that's because that's supposedly where he wrote most of his screenplays, was while laying in the bathtub.
Which would become the fuel for McCarthy's Red Scare. The Berlin incident we mentioned in a previous video, the one with the airlift, had people on edge. But in 1949, the Cold War took a step into high gear. That year, despite the best attempts by the United States, the Communist Party of China, with its leader Mao Zedong, became the de facto leader of all mainland China.
Note that he said mainland China. That's because the previous Chinese government had escaped to Taiwan and set up there. So Taiwan is the remnants of the old Chinese government, and China doesn't control that. Now, if you ask them, they'll say they do, and that the government there is illegitimate and is not to be mentioned. It's a really sore sticking point for China. And Taiwan, of course, asserts their independence. They assert that they are the real China, and it's very complicated. It's, to this day, very complicated. It's a source of constant tension, and it has a very real potential of eventually ending in a global conflict of some kind. I hope that never happens, but it's one of those areas where such a thing could happen.
A vast, powerful ally to the Soviet Union. Also, self-plug, you can watch a video we did on the story which led to Mao's coming to power in this video here. In addition, 1949 saw the Soviet Union successfully test its first nuclear weapon, breaking the American monopoly. This was a shock to American intelligence. The successful test came much faster than they had anticipated, and the most destructive weapons ever devised were now in the hands of an enemy with whom they were in a tense diplomatic situation with. They suspected Soviet spies
Julius
were in their midst,
Rosenberg
giving secrets of the bomb to them. This, of course, was later confirmed in 1950 with the arrest of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
Now, I'm just going to stop it here. There's a lot of controversy over the Rosenbergs to this day, but even at this time, there was a lot of controversy for a lot of reasons. Julius Rosenberg, pretty much unquestionably guilty. The evidence is heavy against him that he was a Soviet spy, that he was feeding them information on the nuclear or the atomic bombs and our work on those items. Now, the role of Ethel Rosenberg in all this is a lot more heavily debated. How much she was involved, how much she even knew about what was going on is debated. There's evidence that she was at least peripherally involved in her husband's work and that she knew what he was doing. However, there's also some evidence that she was at best peripherally involved and the others were played a more important role in supporting Julius than she did. And another big part of the controversy is the sentence. So they are both sentenced to execution as traitors to the United States. This is the first execution of traitors that we've had. And a lot of people, even those who wanted the Rosenberg punished, the law allowed for life in prison or execution. The government pushed for execution. That's what they ended up getting. A lot of people were not so sure that was the right sentence, especially in the case of Ethel. Julius, again, was not as controversial. Ethel was much more controversial. And you had a lot of people at that time protesting the decision to execute these two. Famous Nobel laureates, Albert Einstein being a prime example of a petition to have these people spared, or at the very least sentenced to life in prison, not executed. The Pope intervened on their behalf. None of it worked. And the execution itself was problematical on another level with Ethel specifically because it was botched. Not once, not twice. 3 times they tried to electrocute her in the electric chair. She survived all 3 attempts. I believe it was the 4th try that finally killed her. And witnesses at the time said that there was smoke rising from her head from all these attempts to kill her. So not only is there controversy on how much she was even involved in this, but there's controversy on how she died, and just the very fact that she was sentenced to that and not something like life in prison. So, very controversial topic. Not that long ago, in the early 2000s, the sons of the Rosenbergs actually brought the case for Ethel back into the public eye, trying to get her name somewhat redeemed. They weren't trying to defend their father. They were mainly interested in redeeming the name of their mother, arguing that she was at best peripherally involved. She may have taken some notes for him and may not have been fully aware of what she was doing. And if she was at best a minor player, and that execution was far too stiff a punishment for her role, especially when other people involved did not get that punishment. So, yeah, it's still kind of an ongoing controversy on what was the appropriate punishment for the Rosenbergs in general and for Ethel in particular.
The 2 were then executed in 1953 for the crime. But this wasn't the only case of highly publicized discoveries of Soviet espionage in the United States. In 1948, a government official by the name of Alger Hiss was accused of being a Soviet spy. The case against Hiss featured the work of former actual...
And talk about controversial, this one's even more controversial, because the evidence against him is lacking, to say the least.
Soviet spy turned conservative darling, Whittaker Chambers, who grilled Hiss on his involvement with the communist movement and spying for the Soviets. The latter of which Hiss denied until his death. Infamous in these proceedings was the Pumpkin Papers. Chambers kept an undeveloped film of super secret documents he claimed Hiss had hidden in a hollowed-out pumpkin on his farm. It was a media spectacle, and there was a lot of paranoia over who out there might be a secret Soviet agent.
And that brings me to a point we probably should discuss real quick. Why was the second Red Scare worse than the first one? There's a lot of reasons, but I think right here is a big one. Not this particular topic, but what we're seeing here, the television. Because this is the first time that we're going to have something like this, television being used to escalate situations like this. There are going to be politicians, the obvious one being Joseph McCarthy himself, that are going to use this media to fan the flames of this fear and paranoia. And there's also going to be people on the other side, famously Edward R. Murrow, who are going to come out and try to expose McCarthy and try to speak directly to the American people and say, hey, look at what we're doing to each other. Look at how we are turning on each other. We're in the grips of a mass hysteria, and we are hurting each other based on accusations, many of which are not proven, and we're destroying ourselves, we're destroying our families, our neighbors. We need to rein it in. So you've got television for the first time really playing a pivotal role in what's going on in this second Red Scare on both sides of the spectrum.
I would be remiss, though, if I didn't mention many investigators and historians dispute the evidence against Hiss. These accusations are very much under suspicion, but the Red Scare was less about the actual threat to the US than it was about the perception of a threat.
Yeah, and that's a really good way of putting it. When people get scared like this, the facts aren't as important to them as the perception. And that's a problem, and that's something that's easily exploited by unscrupulous politicians. They'll seize on fear, they'll exploit it, they'll escalate it, they will come in with solutions. Often, I've mentioned this in other videos, you'll have the only I can fix it type of presentation, which helps them rise to power. And it's not just here in the United States. That's how people like Mussolini, Angry Mustache Man, get to power. They create an enemy, they stoke the fear of the enemy, and then they step in and say, I can fix it. And that's kind of what we're going to see here with people like McCarthy. they see this fear and panic spreading, they're going to step in and say, hey, we're going to take care of this for you. The communist threat is real. They're out there among you. They could be your neighbor. They could be your coworker. They could be that uncle that annoys you at Thanksgiving. And we're going to find them. We're going to identify them, and we're going to take care of them for you. And that's how these things happen.
Many conservatives at the time already thought changes made in the last several decades, such as the end of child labor, the introduction of women's suffrage, and the New Deal, were all communist plots.
Of course they were.
The Republican Party saw the paranoia rising in the American electorate. They decided that if they could stoke these fires and call the Democrats soft on communism, they might just get more votes. No Republican jumped on that plan harder than Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Exactly.
In February of 1950, McCarthy, at a meeting...
Now, to be fair to the Republicans, a lot of them are going to realize that it's getting out of control, and they're going to turn on McCarthy. And Eisenhower is going to be working in the background to prepare to deal with McCarthy. Now, what Eisenhower is doing is he's not getting directly involved, but he is paying attention. He is making plans to deal with this because he knows he sees McCarthy getting out of control. And he's just kind of waiting for the right moment for McCarthy to make just the wrong move that will give him the opening to bring McCarthy crashing down. And that's going to come soon. And of course, it's not just, I don't want to imply that it's just Eisenhower. There's a lot of people in the administration, there's a lot of Republicans that are starting to turn on him because he's getting out of control. He's taking this too far, and they see it, and they're going to rein him in. And again, I mentioned Edward R. Murrow is also going to help rein him in by reaching out to the public and say, hey, this has gone too far, and it's not just McCarthy. We are contributing to this. Look in the mirror. Look at yourself. You are contributing to this with your fear, with your suspicion, with your willingness to blame your neighbors or your friends, or to even just suspect them.
The Republican Women's Club brandished a piece of paper and claimed he had in his hands the list of 205 people who worked in the State Department who were known to be members of the Communist Party. Coverage of it turned him into an overnight celebrity, and this is what earned the second Red Scare the nickname McCarthyism. The US government set up anti-communist panels at every level, from small-town local governments to the White House. The purpose was to root out, interrogate, and remove from their jobs anyone who was a secret communist. The FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, received a massive boost in funding and scope to help with this mission. Now, remember when I mentioned the American labor movement and the first Red Scare? Well, it's important now, because before those crackdowns, being a socialist or an anarchist or a communist was not that big a deal.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Prior to the first Red Scare, and well, let's just say prior to the Russian Revolution, being a socialist, being associated with that, or being somebody who follows the teachings of Marx and whatever, was not seen as that bad. At least not on the level we're going to see later, by any stretch of the imagination. But got to remember, communism was theoretical at this time. It had never been tried in practice, at least not on a state level. We can argue that certain small villages might have engaged in something along the line of communism. Certainly, certain hunter-gatherer societies could be described as communistic in their nature. They have to share everything to survive. There is no private ownership of land, of any means of production. Everybody is working to ensure the survival of everybody else. This happened also in things like little serf villages or peasant villages in pre-industrial revolution times. You can have, on a small local scale, sure. On a state scale, it's never been tried. And I pointed this out in other videos, but I want to emphasize it again here. When we're talking about a communist government, that's an oxymoron. Communism, by definition, a communist government, by definition, can't exist. Communism is, by definition, a stateless society. So if you have a state, if you have a government, you're not communist by definition. You are some form of extreme socialism. And more often than not, you're a totalitarianism or authoritarianism type government. But To be a communist, in the strictest sense, you have to be a stateless society.
Many left-leaning young activists got involved with these unions and groups, many of whom were scared off or left those groups after the first Red Scare.
Right.
Well, now a bunch of those people had grown older and had jobs in the US government.
Right.
And according to firebrands like McCarthy, even former members were suspicious.
Yeah, even if you were a member 20 years ago, 30 years ago, doesn't matter. Once a commie, always a commie.
Many government employees had to go before these panels, the most infamous of these being the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC.
Yeah, HUAC. And yes, that is who you think that is. That's Walt Disney. He did testify before the House Unethical, I can never say that right, HUAC, excuse me. He did testify, and he was testifying on two fronts. He was testifying against members of his own workforce that were part of socialist, left-wing, radical labor unions. Disney famously hated labor unions, so he seized upon this as an opportunity to denounce them, and that's kind of what I was talking about when you talk about the Red Scare. You're really talking about a witch hunt. It's not that different than what happened in Salem. You have people just convinced that there's evil among us, whether it's a witch or whether it's a commie, and it could be anywhere. And it's a perfect opportunity if you've got an axe to grind, if you've got a grudge you want to deal with, it's a perfect opportunity to do it. Accuse your neighbor of being a witch, of hexing your cow so that it died. That kind of thing happened in the Salem witch trials. And then again here, you've got people accusing others of being communist because you've got a grudge against them or you don't like what they're doing. And Disney's kind of in that picture right here because that's kind of what he's doing. He's using this to frame his labor union employees as socialist. Now, he's kind of on the spot too because this is a period where they're going after Hollywood. So he also names names of other people, which is another thing that's really prominent in the second Red Scare, not Red Square. That's an entirely different thing. He's going to name names of other people that he suspects or knows to be communist. And that's really common in these particular hearings, because one way that you can get off or at least get a reduced penalty would be to name names. Give them bigger fish to fry or more fish to fry, and you might get off or get off easier. Disney is just one of many examples of people who name names and or went in with an axe to grind like he also does with his labor union employees.
Their most publicized investigation was not focused on government employees, but into Hollywood. They brought many famous film executives, actors, and directors to find out who had secret communist sympathies. And that's why Disney was who left of center wound up being blacklisted, preventing them from making or performing in movies for years, or often ever again.
And it wasn't just movies, it was also any kind of entertainment. The blacklist, for example, is going to hit a lot of folk groups, notably the Weavers, which up until this time was one of the biggest groups. But the Weavers are going to be hit by this. One of the singers in the Weavers, Pete Seeger, is going to be called up in front of this hearing. And he doesn't take the typical path that a lot of the people take in these hearings. He doesn't deny anything. Instead, he just says, I'm an entertainer. I am a folk singer. I collect songs from all over the world. I sing songs from all different cultures. This is what I do. I'm a singer. I have this. This is a country that has free speech. I have a right to free speech. And you can't stop me. I will sing some of the songs I've sung, and you can judge me based on that. It's really an interesting take on how he approaches this. But yeah, it's not just, it's all aspects of the entertainment industry, but especially Hollywood. And there is that anti-Semitic element to that as well, because Jews were a big part of Hollywood at this time.
At the peak of this witch hunt, you saw propaganda such as anti-communist films and sensationalist journalism, which today look absolutely ridiculous from our vantage point. Now, of course, this wasn't fun and games. Many people had their lives completely upended and even destroyed by these investigations.
Absolutely.
One of the examples I don't think gets enough attention is what's now called the Lavender Scare.
Yeah, the Lavender Scare, I'm glad he brought this up. I almost forgot about this. So this starts out as a Red Scare. People are socialist or they're communist, but it also starts to bring in other groups. There's some anti-Semitism, again, like I mentioned, but there's also a big push against the gay communities as well. They get kind of lassoed into all this.
These investigations into secretive behavior often exposed government employees who were LGBTQ+. They'd then be fired for that. This hunt for secret gay government employees continued long after the peak of the Red Scare. In 1953, McCarthy turned his eye towards secret communists in the military.
Oops.
During the hearings, the Army accused McCarthy and his attorney, Roy Cohn, of not conducting their investigation in a fair manner.
This is what really comes back to bite him in the butt. This crosses the line for some of the Republicans and especially for Eisenhower. This was what Eisenhower was waiting for. This was McCarthy crossing a line one too far where Eisenhower knew that now he got his chance. He can bring this guy down now. And even if that weren't the case, when McCarthy goes after the Army, Big Daddy Ike is going to come in. There's no way around that.
The report didn't say much, but the televised hearings made McCarthy look like he was being a dishonest bully. His popularity dropped in the polls, and the Republican Party, fearing he'd become a liability, began to distance themselves from him and his work. He was soon condemned by many Republican colleagues. The Senate eventually voted to censure him in 1954. McCarthy then faded into the background and has since become a synonym for paranoid witch hunts. Now, while this was the peak of anti-communist paranoia, the hunt for secret communists would continue less vigorously until well into the 1960s. Many lives were ruined, and left-wing politics continued to be a sideline political current in the United States. It also brought the Cold War home. Now Americans felt anyone could be a potential communist, which would shape culture going forward. Association with socialism or the left was a way to smear the character of civil rights activists, environmentalists, and, when we get to the Vietnam War, anti-draft activists.
Absolutely.
It's a specter.
It does come up again with the anti-draft activists. Oh, they're commies, they're socialists. And to this day, you'll still hear these accusations being thrown around. It's not gone. It's not as bad as it was during the Red Scares, but it's still there. And it probably will be for a very long time to come.
Still haunting America to this day, just one of the many lasting legacies of the Cold War we continue to deal with. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and to press the bell button.
Yeah, always consider supporting our original content creators. We want them to keep doing this stuff. I actually had a hard time finding anything on McCarthyism that wasn't some kind of a news bulletin or a full-length documentary by a company where I would have had to deal with copyright issues. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I'll see you all next time. Or actually, I'll see you tomorrow for part 1 of The Cold War by Oversimplified. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.